and welcome back to our session for 2:30. We are going to be discussing a post-award and research finance topic, asset construction. It's a piece of cake, and I know this is going to be a great session. Mary Stanley is going to be presenting this, and she has 30 years of research admin experience between two major research universities, and this includes proposal submission, contract negotiation, post-award administration and billing, compliance monitoring, audit coordination, and institutional reporting. Although Mary would never tell you that she has a favorite area, she will admit she is a compliance geek at heart. Those of us that know her already know that. I'm just tell her. All challenges involving property acquisition, monitoring, and reporting make her super happy, as she finds she is always learning something new. Helping faculty meet the challenges of the ever-changing research world continued to be the key to her job satisfaction and fulfillment. I also wanted to mention that Mary received her master's degree in research administration from Emmanuel College. We'd mentioned some of the other universities that offer the master's in research administration, and so wanted to give a shout out to her alma mater as well. So with that, we're going to be doing the same things that we have been doing. Your microphone and video will be turned off during the course of this presentation. Please place your questions in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat for Mary as we go along, and we'll address the questions as they come. So with that, Mary, we turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jennifer. I thought this would be an interesting topic because it's a fairly new topic for the University of Central Florida, in that we found that our faculty were building assets more often, or as often as they purchase them, and they were ahead of our ability to manage it administratively. So I want you, as we go through this, to think of this as kind of a case study, because there are a lot of factors at your institutions that could relate to what we're doing at the University of Central Florida, or maybe drastically different, but depending upon some variables in your accounting system, etc. But this example, we are a PeopleSoft school, if that helps anyone who is also using PeopleSoft. We are transitioning to a new accounting system, but they have not disclosed to us yet if they have a built-in feature for managing asset construction. So that may be relevant to know. Another reason that this evolved is we found that there were 3 offices, at least administrative offices, who were trying to manage this process. One is the Office of Research, because most often these constructed assets are being paid on research projects. Also was our Finance and Accounting office, because they were doing the accounting reconciliation, the monthly statements, the year-end statements, capitalization, and so forth. And we're finding a variety of transactions in equipment account codes that by themselves looked unusual. And the third office was the property office, because they're responsible for decaling pieces of equipment. And we found that some of the components that were greater than 5,000 were getting decaled prematurely, and it was forcing them to delete decals and re-decal the finished piece. So we decided to get together, and really for the purpose of making this easier for our departmental units. Those purchase transactions are starting at the administrative unit, by the administrators in the department, and on behalf of their researchers. And we figured out that it would be our hope was that it would be very helpful to provide them with a tool that would help them get from proposal to decaling, knowing what is expected of them by these three offices. So you'll notice there's kind of a sequential order to this presentation. That's kind of what we would call, as research administrators, cradle to grave. The next slide, please. So the basics that may be helpful, and also too, this is a presentation that we have presented on campus. We have presented it to the units and the unit administrators, and I have given it out to researchers who do a lot of asset construction, because I wanted them to have an opportunity to look at it, see if we're addressing their questions. So you'll notice the audience is the unit. But the basics for us is that the value of a constructed piece of equipment must exceed $5,000 and have a useful life of greater than 1 year. That's because that's the university's definition of a piece of equipment. And so we stipulated that up front because we found we were tracking components and they would say they're done, and it only added up to $3,500. And so then we're looking at moving a lot of costs out of an equipment account code back to an expense account code. So we're reminding everyone up front what the definition of a piece of equipment is. Another component is constructed equipment should be permanently assembled and stay assembled. That means just because you put it all together and stack it all up for an NSF project, the project's over and you deconstruct it into its basic parts and put it together in a different way or never reconstruct it, that does not make it a piece of equipment. Once they declare it's a piece of equipment, they build the asset, it gets decaled. It's the same as buying a piece of equipment. They have to dispose of that equipment the same as they would something that they purchase. We also run into problems with whether a repair gets capitalized, replacement parts, add-ons. So if that's something your institution has not considered to define, we're not talking about those things today. Today we're talking about just all the pieces and parts that come together to make that final piece of equipment. Also, a reminder is sometimes we found that they're actually building two pieces of equipment. Yes, they are being used on the project, but we found out that the two do not work together permanently, but separately those two are pieces of equipment. So we actually track them as two separate pieces. Sometimes they're building one, sometimes they're building more than one. Next slide, please. Oh, and also too, it probably bears mentioning, if you have any questions as we're going, since this kind of is a topical and linear presentation, if you want to ask your questions as we're going, I'm happy to see what I can do to answer them, or you can wait to the end to see if it gets addressed. I'll leave that up to you. So to us, the recipe is what they need to do at the proposal phase, what to do post-award, meaning the funds are here, but you haven't started buying pieces and parts and you haven't started to assemble your equipment. And then what to do when your construction is complete. Next slide, please. So the construction of a piece of equipment should be disclosed in the proposal to the sponsor. And that's very important because our federal property auditor often refers back to, well, what did you tell the sponsor you were going to do? So there's bid and quote limits in the FAR, in the uniform guidance. We all know what those are. We know there's a method of procurement at each of your institutions. So they're looking at whether we're following our own policies and procedures and whether we are following the government's policies and procedures. So the construction of a piece of equipment, if you know you're not going to buy it, but that you're going to assemble it either to use on the project or perhaps it's a deliverable to your sponsor, that should be disclosed in the scope of work. When preparing the proposal budget, remember only those components that become a permanent part of the completed asset should be on the equipment line. So if you have extra parts, replacement parts, or tools that you're going to use to assemble the piece of equipment, but they're not part of its form or function, those would typically be expense, unless they on their own meet that definition of equipment, which exceeds $5,000 and has a useful life of greater than 1 year. Next slide, please. Whether or not facilities and administrative costs that we all know as overhead are allowed should not be a factor into decisions about whether a piece is expense or equipment. So a lot of times, especially on equipment only awards or these major equipment awards, we just see one line in the budget and there is a description of what they're going to build. But in reality, so when we set up the award, it all gets budgeted into equipment. But in reality, there's ancillary tools and pieces that are used to assemble it that need to be charged to the expense category because our accounting system would not capitalize it as part of equipment. So those considerations need to be thought through at the time of proposal about what is part of the form and function of what you're building. And whether or not, or for all proposals where all costs were erroneously included in the equipment category, in fact, when the transaction, whether it's a Pcard purchase or a requisition, you may find that the accounting system would require that to be paid from an expense category. And often when the question comes up, why is my account getting hit with overhead? And we explain that the issue is, well, overhead's not allowed. Well, sometimes that's true, but other times it was allowable. We just didn't propose it in an overhead bearing category. Next slide, please. All right, so now the award is here and we're ready to begin to construct our asset. Slide, please. So before construction begins, the Office of Research's property procedures state that we will pre-approve all equipment purchases. Now, this is currently built into our workflow in PeopleSoft. So if a department enters a requisition that has an equipment account code, workflow will automatically kick it to the Office of Research to affirm that it's an allowable charge on the award. Or whether, and if it wasn't proposed, for example, do we need agency approval to make the purchase? The Office of Research will respond within the rec system and approve the purchase and identify what kind of decal to put on the piece. At UCF, we have different decaling based upon who owns the equipment. If UCF gets to keep it at the end of the project, it gets a CF decal. If the government has vesting rights, it'll have a US decal. And if it's a non-federal sponsor like Lockheed Martin or a state entity, it'll get a CG decal. So we tell them up front we reiterate who owns it by providing that decal approval, which also carries through to that property group that I referred to earlier, because they will look at the requisition when they get the receiving report that the equipment is for a purchase when it's here. They'll look to see what decal was approved when they go out to put a decal on it. Now, equipment construction can bypass this process. If they are building a piece of equipment out of all requisitions, each of those requisitions comes through because it meets the definition of an equipment requisition. But there's no real unity and communication in all cases that tells the person reviewing it in the Office of Research that all these go together. Furthermore, Pcards do not have a workflow, and of course, journals don't either. So there's lots of ways to circumvent that process. So what I'm going to describe on the next couple of slides is a way to combine this into the least laborious number of steps for the unit that still communicate to everyone that needs to know that asset construction is beginning. Next slide,
Terry,
please.
Yeah. We have a question, and I don't know if you're going to get to this later, about insurance. If you have to insure it, even though it may be provided by the agency or sponsor, do we then need to have an asset tag for this piece of equipment?
So I guess the question, I'm not sure. Let's see. If we, the institution, has to insure the equipment, even though it may be provided by an agency or sponsor, do we then need to have? So at our university, that's correct. We do. And any decal that would, or any piece of equipment that's in the university's possession, to get the benefit of the inventory, meaning that it gets a decal, we scan it, we know where it is annually, and some of these projects go on for 4 and 5 years. It has to have a decal to be part of that oversight. Furthermore, if the equipment is purchased by the university, yes, it has to have a decal to be covered by the university's insurance, and that includes assets that we're building. But if a third party loans us a piece of equipment, which that question kind of made me think that was the question, currently the university has to purchase supplemental insurance to cover third-party equipment in our possession. It still will get decaled, but the insurance comes through a supplemental policy. Did that answer the question?
Terry, did that? Okay, thank you.
All right, cool. So let's see. Next slide, please. All right, so before construction begins, what we're asking the units to do is to send an email, and in one shot, they can copy all 3 offices. The Office of Research is going to, again, approve for allowability and provide the decal information. Financial Affairs is not going to respond, but they're going to go ahead and initiate a financial tracking sheet in their office so that when the monthly financial system and statements are prepared, they know that there's some unusual transactions that are associated with a pending asset build. And so it doesn't create a hiccup for them. And for us, the same thing in compliance. We now know that there's a piece of equipment. So if there's questions coming up about why there's transactions that don't meet the equipment threshold that are posting in an equipment account code, we know why. It also is helpful when it's property reporting time, when we start to review these projects and see those transactions, we know why they're there because we know there's an asset build in process. Next slide, please. What we're asking to be included in that email is what the item will be called when the construction is completed. So we can see the description of all the pieces and parts, but what are you building? And this is important because the property department will use that as the property description when they add this completed asset into the inventory system. We also want to know the anticipated project or department numbers that will be charged for the pieces and parts. And this is especially important when you're charging more than one project, because we need to know that the piece of equipment is going to be finished within the start and end dates of those projects. We want to know that it's being used to advance the project and support the project and so forth. So we go through to look at those allowability and allocability issues. Same with the estimated completion date. Often we'll get a request for approval to build an asset, but the estimated completion date is 6 months after the end date. So we have to go back and remind the researchers that that's after the end date, and how are they using it on the project if the project's over. And so they can go, and get extensions and so forth to make sure that they're able to complete the scope of work and complete the asset construction. And of course, we want to know if it was proposed or not. And if it wasn't proposed, that's okay too. But do you have approval by your sponsor to build this asset? Specifically, if it wasn't proposed, what changed that now you have to build an asset that was not planned as part of your scope of work? Next slide, please. We also want, I just said that. If it wasn't proposed, again, what tasks are you using it on? What happened that made this unanticipated piece of equipment? And I would think the same logic would be true if you're buying large pieces of equipment that were not proposed. You know, what happened that you didn't anticipate this? And then the total estimated value, it helps us, that's not a locked in amount, but it helps us determine early in the process. If they tell us, well, $3,200, we can go back and say, that's not going to be a piece of equipment because it doesn't meet the $5,000 threshold. So we're trying to head off headaches for the departments that we would hit them with later in the process. We're trying to communicate that earlier. Next slide, please. Excuse me. If multiple project numbers are being utilized to pay for these components, we want to know, again, that it's going to be completed beforehand, but much more important, we want to know the allocation method. And the main reason for this is we are finding that as part of our federal property review, if our federal property auditor pulls one of these decals and looks at the financial transactions, sometimes they will ask us, well, how did you determine the allocation method? And how did you know, and they're looking for something logical. They've never pushed back and denied a response. They're looking for something that makes sense. Well, we used it, you know, 2/3 of the time we used it on 12 tasks over here and only 1 task here. So we split the charge based on usage. Whatever that method is, she has accepted it if it is reasonable. But most importantly, I think she's testing to see that we had an allocation method. So again, we're asking that early in the process. You've identified you're charging 2 projects. How did you determine how much to charge each project? And we're looking for something that makes sense to us. Then we can explain it to the auditor and defend it to the auditor. Next slide, please. So this is an example of one that we've received. We will use the constructed equipment 15% of the time on this project to complete task 7 and so on. You can see that there's some logic here. We aren't in the business of second guessing the researcher. We take them at their word, and that looks reasonable. That looks like something that was thought through, and I think that it is a pretty decent explanation. There are others, I'm sure, but I wanted to give an example of what a good allocation method explanation would look like. Next slide, please. As opposed to this one, $4,290 was charged to Project A because that was the amount of available budget. The balance of $25,000 was charged to my startup. UCF is paying the majority of the costs, and I don't have any more startup budget, so that's okay, right? In this case, when I asked them, they weren't even using the equipment on Project A at all. It was more of an available balance kind of answer. So of course we had to come up with another process. So the idea here is we would much rather uncover that earlier in the process so that we can work with our units, as opposed to when the auditor's here and they disallowed the charges. You know, especially if this had been against 2 projects, they might have disallowed the whole thing. Next slide, please. So the Office of Research, I think we've kind of gone through there, just explaining again who's going to respond, what the information is going to entail, and just reiterating that Financial Affairs and the Compliance Office are not going to respond. It's really just a notification so we can all initiate our respective tracking processes. Next slide. So construction assembly. Next slide. Okay, so once the Office of Research approval is in hand, the procurement of components can commence. And you know, I'm not going to tell you that often the cart's before the horse. Sometimes that's already started while the review's being done and we have to kind of backtrack and get everything in order. But ideally, they don't start purchasing till they have the approval. And what we're asking the departments to do is include a copy of the Office of Research or approval to purchase. along with, it should include that original request to build an asset, along with their requisitions, attach it to the Pcard receipts and any journals. That just keeps everyone who touches that financial transaction along the way to say, hey, this is part of a bigger purchase, a bigger compilation of costs. And this is especially important for the requisitions because that workflow is coming through the Office of Research. It helps the approval personnel to know that this is part of something bigger. They've already approved it, so they don't have to review that requisition as if they've never seen it before. The hope is that that constant communication will flush out problems early and expedite review because we're just now following through on something that's already been approved. Next slide. So we are asking that the department and/or the technical team, I've seen it being managed in both places, complete this spreadsheet. And I kind of gave you a snippet of what the categories are as they start to buy these components, so that when they come to us and say, look, we're done, they can give us this spreadsheet of all the pieces and parts that comprise the constructed asset. And just to remind you, again, some of these pieces may be over 5,000 and some may be under. It's a variety of financial transactions. So this kind of puts it all into one place so that we can all review it once we get notification that the construction and assembly is complete. Next slide. So all the components, and again, just those that are permanently affixed to the final piece of constructed equipment, should be tracked on that spreadsheet. And they do need to be paid through an equipment account code. So that's because we are building a piece of equipment. The anticipated completed value is over 5,000, so it meets the definition of equipment. And of course, on a project would be exempt from overhead unless you had a total direct cost scenario. We don't want to see the spreadsheet in the interim. There may be occasions that someone is specifically maybe at fiscal year end may ask to see it, but for the most part, it's something that we get at the time that the project is done. Certainly from a financial compliance point of view, we don't look at it till the end. So it's something that they just keep on going as they're buying pieces and parts. Next slide. Okay, so the value of the components tracked on the asset will become the asset value that is assigned when that piece of equipment is decaled and entered into our PeopleSoft property system. And I mentioned that as opposed to, if you remember back at the pre-expenditure review, we asked them to estimate how much the completed value will be. That really was a guide. This actually is what will become the value of the piece of equipment. So they will tally that column and enter that into the property system along with the description name, the decal, and all the other property related details. Next slide. So please note, and if you're like me, this is where my geek starts to show. Some of these, I tried to give you some examples of what we have found once we started looking at these transactions. But tools used to construct the asset but are not permanently affixed should not be charged to the equipment account code. Unless they're standalone items, you know, that individual piece was used to build an asset for some reason, but it also costs 5,000 or more and had a useful life of greater than 1 year, yes, that would be another piece of equipment. But generally, the tools that we're finding are not equipment. And I gave you some examples here. Yes, we did find a dustpan and a broom and an upholstery stapler. When we start looking at those Pcard charges, often what we're hearing is, well, the majority of the items that we got at Home Depot were related to the asset construction. So we just put the whole thing in the equipment account code. And the accounting of that just doesn't work that way. So generally, we will spot check the Pcard receipts at the end. And if we find a fair enough of that, a number of them that has some suspicious pieces on there, or something that we just could not defend were part of the form or function of a piece of equipment, we'll go back to the technical team and ask questions. And generally, it's just a judgment error along the way somewhere. They will readily admit, no, that shouldn't be there. And then we can start to clean up those transactions. But what we're trying to avoid by mapping these things out is that after the fact cleanup as much as possible. So just as a reminder, pieces and parts still have to meet the allocation and allowability rules in the uniform guidance. And if it looks funny to us, chances are it's going to also look funny to the auditor, and we're going to have to ask anyway. So we're trying to stay in front of this so we have these transactions resolved long before the auditor is looking at them. Next slide, please. So standard allocation methods from the uniform guidance will apply. So there are some laser systems, other kinds of systems that use very expensive specialty bulbs, and there's only one bulb in it, but it's cheaper to go ahead and buy 6. That's not a problem. But generally, we have been questioned by the auditor, well, why did we pay for all 6? If you only used for one of them during the life of the project, what happened to the other 5? So we are starting to look at the quantity. That's not typically as big as an abuse item or an oversight item as maybe outright not allocable at all. But it is something that we want to caution our researchers and our departments to pay attention to how many they purchase and how many are really part of the form and the function of what they're building. And of course, unallowable expenditures should not be paid from sponsor funds, even if they are part of the receipt. So sometimes those bulbs are appropriate in expense. They're still allowable on the project, the extra bulbs, especially if it's something they anticipate they'll use all 6 over 2 years, but they may not, the machine only uses 1 at a time. So there's some discussion and judgment in there, and we try to be as lenient and fair as possible. Again, it boils down to, does the explanation or the need make sense? Is it something we can explain to an auditor later? Next slide. So I also wanted to give you some examples of what an unacceptable justification for using the equipment account code. And no one's ever asked us to state that we used everything paid under an equipment account code, and that's true. As the volume of constructed assets has grown over the years, we have started looking at these transactions closer than we ever have historically. That, although that's a true statement, that's still not a reason for charging components that you didn't use on the project to the project. Say with the majority of the receipt was components used to build the assets, so we just put the whole invoice in the equipment account code on the project. And of course, I don't think the broom and dustpan are a big surprise to anyone. Next slide. It is not unusual for the components included in the construction to have a value of $5,000. So we've already covered. Please do not decal the component unless it's a standalone item and not going to be part of the form and function of the constructed piece. And I alluded to this earlier. The reason is our property unit will go out and put a decal on it, and then 6 months later, that value has gone from $7,000 to $152,000. And it's because the construction continued and it turned out that $5,000 component or that $7,000 component was part of a much larger piece of equipment. So if the components get decaled too early, depreciation will begin the moment it gets decaled and may have already been reported in our financial statements. And the decal will eventually have to be retired and a new decal issued to the whole component. We did have a fairly lengthy project once that had a constructed asset, and a $5,000 piece was purchased in the first month of the first year, and it was fully depreciated before we realized it was part of a much bigger constructed asset. So although that only happened one time, we don't want that to happen again. And so we found the more often we're just monitoring the progress, we can kind of head some of these issues off so that the researcher is not bothered by us late in the game with bad news. Next slide. Yay, construction is complete. Next slide. Okay, so when the construction of the equipment is completed, notification is sent to Financial Affairs along with that completed asset spreadsheet delineating the expenditures. They will review it and then they send it to our Financial Compliance Office, who reconciles the expenditures to the project. What that entails is, in that spreadsheet, they had to identify the project number and what they purchased. We're also going to go back and look at the charges and make sure that everything that was billed to the project account number was on that spreadsheet. And if it wasn't, is it over 5,000 in its own standalone piece of equipment, or was it a transaction that got paid out of the equipment account code that should not have? So, and sometimes we find that they forgot to put it on the spreadsheet. It's perfectly acceptable. We're all guilty of human error from time to time. And sometimes we do stumble across something that was charged to the wrong project. So we're just looking to make sure that everything that posted in the equipment account code was part of either an outright equipment purchase or part of the asset build. Next slide. We will contact the departments and or the researcher if we find any of those transactions that don't seem to reconcile. And of course, as I mentioned before, we're spot checking the Pcard purchases to see if they make sense. And often, if you just scroll through the Pcard statements, you can see the description and tell, that makes sense, that makes sense. And we're certainly laymen, so we're looking for something that looks reasonable. And if so, we keep moving, assuming that if the auditor were to question it, the technical team could explain it. But we're looking for anomalies, things that don't quite seem to fit or might to a layman appear not to be part of the constructed asset. Next slide. Once Financial Affairs and the Financial Compliance Office have completed the reconciliations, the constructed item is approved, and the decaling, the item will be decaled and entered into the property system. Next slide. So this really is the important part, because I can imagine up to now, some people, one could think this is a lot of work, and it is a lot of work. But our property auditor is very good to us and very reasonable. But she also can ask hard questions. So, and mainly what she's looking for, are you following your own policies and procedures? So if the university has something as an official policy, or it's a guideline on the Office of Research website, or the Finance and Accounting website, Purchasing's website, they're looking to make sure that we are being good stewards of federal money, and that their money's being afforded the same safeguards that we're protecting the university's money. So first and foremost, she is looking to make sure that we're following all federal procedures and policies and guidelines, as well as our own. She does have access to all of that, and we'll review it. She generally picks high transactions and low transactions. And she will also pick a random assortment of decals. And then she wants to see all the purchasing information about that. So by our tracking those spreadsheets, flushing out unallowable expenditures, identifying that decal early and making sure when she gets here we have the correct decal on it, we are way ahead of her next visit, so that no matter what random order she's picking to test transactions, we are reasonably sure we're prepared for that. And this, we put this in the slide because I believe it might have been a surprise to most researchers, but that does include Pcard transactions. She does want to see the actual receipt. She doesn't do a lot, but she will spot check it, especially if she sees that we're building an asset. Next slide. I kind of went ahead of that, but when we get that list from her, and of course, anybody who is federal property auditor is the Office of Naval Research, you know that they're all of those audit processes are defined in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. So she's sending us those lists before she comes. She wants to see the requisition. She's looking at vendor quotes to make sure we're following our own bid and quote limits. We have to give her documentation of that. If we used a sole source, we have to give her the justifications and the approvals. She does know that our policy says we pre-approve all equipment purchases, so she's now looking to make sure that ORC approval is attached. And she doesn't really care whether it's in workflow or an email, so she just wants to know that that coordination is happening when we say it is. We do provide a copy of the purchase order if the component was purchased through a requisition. Next slide. She follows it through to the receiving report, showing that the item was delivered. And of course, the introduction into the inventory system and the annual, all of our property has to be dealt with annually. So it's either scanned, certified off campus, or reported as lost or stolen. So she's looking to make sure we're following our own inventory processes. So this is kind of a reiteration of all of that. She's just part of our audit approval. And when we are able to declare that we have a federally approved property system, she's declaring that we are following all of our federal regulations. We're following our own policies, procedures. And a finding in either of those areas can result in a formal finding. And that sounds like it's redundant, but the first use of the word finding means sometimes she'll identify something and she knows that that's unusual for us. And, we can kind of give enough evidence to show that it was an anomaly. So she may tell us about it, which we call a finding, but it doesn't end up in our final report. We like those. But, sometimes the more egregious it is, or the more we're caught off guard, the more that our department unit or the researcher is not able to explain it and are caught off guard. Those kind of things start to find their way into her exit report. And another thing to note that I find very interesting, she is now asking if a department, if we find something that was a human error, a judgment error, or it just slipped through the cracks, often she'll come back and ask us, how is their departmental policies and procedure being updated to ensure that this doesn't fall through the cracks in the future? And it's an excellent question. So we have started documenting, even in our own internal review, when we find something, we will follow through and say, okay, how are you going to update your procedures to make sure we're minimizing this happening again? To stay ahead of that so that we are getting well on our own rather in response to something that she found. Next slide. So the department's responsibilities in all of this is to ensure the principal investigators and the technical teams are aware that there are policies and procedures and processes related to equipment construction, and to ensure the proper proposal practices are followed for estimating equipment costs and expenses and repairs. That we're calling things using the proper terminology and budgeting them appropriately in our proposals. That we're maintaining a departmental procedure. So we can all have as many central policies and procedures as possible, but if the department doesn't have a way to implement that at the local transaction level, you're going to have an increased likelihood of having problems. So we want the department to have an internal, who's responsible, who's the first review, who's the second review, whatever that is. And we do not dictate how that departmental policy looks. We just want to know that they have one and that they're aware that there are university rules and there is a process, and that their departmental process supports those bigger university processes. And we want the department to ensure Pcard users and approvers are properly verifying the account codes that are being processed for these receipts, and that they are aware and understand allocation practices when they're charging sponsored projects. You know, alcohol is one of those things that is always generally a no, but we've all had the alcohol research project where it was allowable. But if for some reason that was a transaction on a Home Depot receipt, no matter how unlikely that is, we would expect the department to recognize, hey, that needs to come off. So, you know, whatever that is, if it's not allowable on the project, it can't be paid through, even if the rest of the Pcard receipt is allowable. Next slide. And that's it. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I don't know if I'm on time or got too much time left.
No, you're doing great on time. We have time for questions if anyone has questions. My first question is, was that pictures, were those pictures taken in your house for baking a cake? And who ate it?
No, in fact, when I put that PowerPoint together, I realized later on that I had the Lego cake, then I had chocolate batter, then I had a vanilla cake coming out of the oven. It was like, so I had to go back and find, at least they're all vanilla now, but I'm not very good at that. So I was surprised I found Legos. One of them, the first one, I think really is a cake with fondant, but this last one I think is Legos, but I'm not really sure.
So you audited the presentation to make sure that it made sense to the scope of work. Okay, good.
That's right. I told you I was a compliance geek. Consistency is important.
Go ahead.
Let's see, what are examples of expenditures that had to be moved to expense accounts, warranty and service agreements? So that's an interesting question. So in terms of warranty, often when you buy a piece of equipment, warranty is part of the purchase of a piece of equipment. So let's say you're building an asset that you anticipate will be $100,000, but you have a $20,000 component, you know, like the big base piece that you're starting with is $20,000. And that vendor is going to come in and install it. They're going to do some training, and that receipt includes a warranty for just that piece. That would all be allowable in the equipment account code because it's part of the equipment purchase. It's ancillary to the piece, but it's all from the same vendor. So the government does allow us to include those things that come from the equipment vendor to be in the equipment account code. I've never seen a warranty come through on some of those expense items. And we do have pieces of equipment that were completely built out of expense items. And by expense items, I mean every single individual transaction was under $5,000. And I've never noticed there being a warranty on something usually off the shelf kind of component purchases. I've never noticed a warranty, but if it was part of what was provided with the component, then yeah, it would be allowable in the as the equipment. Service agreements, no, unless it was part of one of the components. That would be an expense item. Sometimes currently the university does not capitalize and include. So if we buy, our faculty member builds this piece of equipment, it's $100,000, but our facilities group needs to come in and upgrade the outlet. so that it has enough amps to run the piece of equipment. It's not a fire hazard, or they have to install an exhaust hood. That typically is not part of what the university capitalizes as part of the equipment. That is considered an internal service because it's not part of the same bid process. It kind of exempts all of those other procurement. I don't know if that'll still be true when our new accounting system goes live. That I've heard it both ways. So some of it really is, and to apply our case study at a new university, you really have to look at what your capabilities are within your own accounting system. What are your property thresholds, and what are the policies and procedures that your purchasing department has? You kind of got to go through where your individual universities land and make sure you're following your own policies and procedures, and then possibly look for a way to streamline that so that you can kind of flag some of things early in the process. And of course, we never want to do journals, but if it's not allowable, it's not allowable, and it's got to come off. And I've never seen our auditor question it if we found it and fixed it. She likes that we're monitoring it. She likes that we are self-regulating. And so she just keeps moving. So that's always good.
So Mary, if someone purchases components and builds an asset, does it stand to reason that it's normally going to vest with the institution if they built it, or would you have to go back to the contract terms or grant terms to find that out?
It's specifically called, well, ideally it was either in the terms and conditions of the award, or if the award's silent, we have been going back and asking for vesting rights at closeout. I have seen, especially on a federal DoD contract where it's the rules are the federal acquisition regulation. If it's over 5,000, it vests with the government until they give us disposition instructions. And I always like to remind the researchers, hey, realize you don't get to keep that till they say we can keep it. And a lot of times the federal sponsor won't let us have it, but they don't want it back either. So they just keep moving it to the next research contract as government furnished equipment until it gets obsolete, and then they abandon it. So it's all over the map. I've seen us build pieces of equipment that were deliverables. So of course that's not going to have a university decal on it. And that kind of begs kind of a basic question is, why are our faculty building so many assets and instead of purchasing them? And I kind of started asking that question. I was curious, and I found that our faculty can build things cheaper than they can buy the finished product off the shelf. They also are building, they can find a piece that's close to what the government needs it to do or the sponsor needs it to do, but it's not quite there, but they know how to take it on to the next level. So often they're building pieces of equipment that are better than anything they could have purchased. And I find that fascinating because we were trying to figure out, we went from 1 or 2 a year to we have probably 20 to 25 different pieces under construction at any given time.
So if a faculty member takes $10,000 worth of components aggregated and puts together something that's worth $20,000 once it's put together, do you still just go back to the $10,000 for saying how much it's worth?
Yeah, the university, again, this is, I think, unique to us, but it may be every university. They've never used the market value. It's always been the compilation of the component costs. And likewise, we depreciate all of our equipment, but we never diminish the value in the property system to zero, which the depreciation is an accounting function, but we never have a piece that shows up out there with a zero value on it. So it's that purchase price or compiled purchase price is it until it's either surplus, returned to the sponsor, or till it dies one day.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
If we don't have any more questions, I guess we'll let Mary go check on some more equipment. But Mary, thank you so much. This was really a good session to help us dig more deeply than we sometimes are able to do on this very unique situation. But it's unique and occurring more and more frequently. I've seen it at every institution where I've ever been. And it's one of those more complex issues that it's great to have a resource of someone who's dug into it and given it a lot of thought. So we truly appreciate your contributions today.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. And I'd like to leave one parting comment.
Thank you.
You know, there's a lot of information here to unpack that as people go away and if they're interested in this and go back to review these PowerPoints, I did put my email at the end. And I am more than happy if there's specific questions that are unique to someone's university or a situation. Please contact me. If I don't know the answer, I will work to find someone who does and can get you to them. We're kind of, knock on wood, I can't remember the last time we had a property audit, so I think we're on the right track, but we do not have all the answers and we are always looking to work smarter. So likewise, if you think there's a piece of this we could do a different way because you've tried it at your university, we would love to hear it. We don't want to put any more burden on our departments than we have to. So anyway, we can work smarter and we're always happy to share information as well.
Thank you. And let me just tell everyone in the audience, if you come up with a question and send it to Mary, she will enjoy digging into it because she's already admitted that she's a little bit geeky on this.
That's absolutely a true statement. I'm embarrassed to say it really makes my day.
Well, thank you again, Mary. We really appreciate what you've shared with us today.